Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thanks for joining our weekly live stream. This is a live discussion we do every week to talk about digital transformation and ERP types of stuff. And it's a tech agnostic view of the world of digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And I'll introduce our guest here in just a moment. But today we are going to talk about tariffs. How to manage supply chains in the world of tariffs, how it's affecting supply chains, how trade wars and geopolitics in general are affecting supply chains. And we'll also talk about just some general trends in the supply chain space as well. So really excited for today's conversation. Supply chain is something that I love. I actually studied it in my master's program, and I've always just loved supply chain management. So I'm really excited for today's discussion. Just a couple logistical items before we introduce our guests. First of all, this is a weekly live stream, live interview we do every Tuesday, same time, same place, wherever you're listening or watching. So thank you for joining from YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, Facebook, TikTok, wherever you're joining from today. Thanks for being here today. But this weekly interview is live. We do it live and then we edit it. We add some content and we make it part of our formal weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So in 2 weeks, this episode the Transformation Ground Control episode will feature this interview. So thanks for being part of the live production of the podcast here today. You can find all past episodes of that show, by the way, by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. Secondly, this is a very engaging audience we typically have here, and I'd love to get audience questions. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to start with, but I would love to hear from you all here today. Any questions you have, that sort of thing. So please chime in at any point, any questions you have. So speaking of the chat, we're watching the chat streams. If you don't mind, just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from. We'd love to hear where you're joining from here today. So with all that being said, joining us to have this discussion here today to talk about all things related to digital transformation is Blythe Milligan. So Blythe, thanks for being here today.
And thank you so much for having me. It's quite an exciting week for a lot of us that work in supply chain and logistics.
Yes, absolutely. And very, very interesting time. I'm going to increase our screens there because I had that wrong. But yeah, thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And I know you're the host of a couple different podcasts. Tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. So born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida, I have an entrepreneurial spirit. And so I've been a business owner for close to 10 years now. Got my start in the logistics realm, working as an executive assistant at an asset-based 3PL here in Jacksonville. It gave me firsthand knowledge, especially working so closely to the executive team of how an asset-based trucking company, 3PL, third-party brokerage, operates in the United States. Was able to work there for a handful of years. Also had some, career, stops in media as well, especially at the local front. I was in local radio and local TV for a period of years, and then transitioned into a solo podcast host for Everything is Logistics. I own a couple companies in the logistics space, and so Cargo Rex is one of them, and then also Digital Dispatch. But Everything is Logistics is the podcast. And so it's been my main focus since we've been fully independent since January 2023. And yeah, it's been an exciting time to be able to peel back the layers that exist within this industry, because with global trade and supply chain and logistics, as I'm sure for a lot of folks have learned over the last week, that the more it's an onion that has endless amounts of layers, and the more you keep pulling back a layer, you're gonna discover even more that you didn't know and that you need to learn. And it's just been a constant learning process, especially over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it seems like the whole tariff trade war thing, especially between the U.S. and China, is throwing a wrench into a lot of supply chains and a lot of supply chain managers' jobs. I'm going to ask you a question about that here in just a second, but I'd love to hear from the audience. A couple things. I have a couple questions for you. I forgot to ask early on, but if you don't mind dropping in the chat what city and country you're joining from today, love to hear where the global community is joining from. We tend to get people from all over the world. So I'd love to hear what city and country you're joining from today. And also, as a follow-up, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat how tariffs and trade wars are affecting you, or are they affecting you? Is it yes, no, not really? I'd love to hear your feedback on how or if some of the trade wars and geopolitics at the moment are affecting your supply chains that you're involved with right now. So if you don't mind, drop that in the chat. I'd love to hear your feedback. But getting back to you, Blythe, when there's a lot of talk about tariffs, especially here in the U.S., and I know other trading partners of the U.S. Are talking a lot about tariffs too, because it's affecting them. But how are you seeing, I know it's early and this is very disruptive, but how are you seeing all these changes to trade and tariffs, how are you seeing that affect supply chains in general so far?
Well, it's basically for anybody who hasn't been paying attention, it's throwing everybody for a loop, especially if you have a small business and maybe you haven't, sort of paid attention to the election cycle here in the US, which I don't blame you if you haven't. It gets a little exhausting at times, but textiles, so clothing, toys, these are typically commodities that are low margin items. And most of them, majority of them, are imported from China, other Southeast Asian countries, and so if you haven't been paying attention, then your business has probably been upended what feels like overnight. For many other companies, they are doing what's called front loading, and so typically in the supply chain year, what you'll see is right after Christmas, typically you have a lot of returns, and so there's a lot of return management that's going on. But there's also a lot of purchasing that's going on ahead of the Chinese New Year, which typically falls at the end of January. But this year in particular was a little bit more volume was being ordered and being front loaded. That's the term that they use in supply chain and logistics, where you're buying so much more goods ahead of time. So typically you're already buying much more goods in order to anticipate the Chinese New Year, which all of the factories and manufacturing shut down for a period of a couple weeks because people are at home with their families. But this year in particular, it's not, they're front loading even more so because they knew that the tariffs were going to be coming down under Trump's, Liberation Day is what he called it on April 2nd, when he instituted, just global tariffs across the board and then started to ease some of those tariffs on other countries. I think there's a 90-day pause that's going on right now, like, for all countries except for China. And so it's been a little bit of an eventful few months, but for a lot of companies, especially a lot of warehousing in North America, so Canada, Mexico, the US, they're storing a lot of goods and in anticipation of what was going to happen on Liberation Day. And so this is where we kind of find ourselves now. If you haven't been paying attention, then you're probably scrambling. If you were paying attention, then you have a little bit more of, I guess, a little bit more of a break where you can kind of have a wait and see approach on what's going to happen, because it's changing seemingly by the hour every day. So it's tough to keep up with a lot of these different announcements.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not an economist, but from what I understand, the intent of the tariffs, at least from the United States perspective, is to basically force manufacturers and companies to move more manufacturing and sourcing back home to the U.S. That clearly isn't going to happen overnight. You can't just build a factory or build a big distribution center in the U.S. just because we're getting tariff now. So what's the reality of how is this affecting sourcing strategies and just the way the supply chains are built in general? Are you seeing any movement or changes yet on that front? I know it's really new, but what are people saying they plan to do, or are they saying?
In a very similar way to in 2020, we all know what happened during that year, and that tend to expedite. That was the first. I guess I should back up a little bit. That during 2020, that was the first time that the general American public, generally the world, kind of found out where a lot of their goods were coming from, and in some cases, it became a wake up call. And so, what you started to see was what's called a nearshoring effort. And so, with nearshoring, you are moving some of your sourcing and some of your products and assembly, you're moving them from China into other countries. So India, Vietnam, Cambodia, even to an extent. A lot of these countries have set up several shops for manufacturing purposes. And then what they have is, it's called a China plus one strategy, where the majority of the world is getting some kind of sourcing, some kind of inputs from China, but then they're going to source those products from China, transfer them, ship them over to another country for assembly. A lot of times that is now transitioning into assembly in Mexico or assembly in Canada, much more so on the Mexico side of things. And so we've seen a lot of nearshoring efforts over the last 5 years. To your point, it takes a long time for manufacturing to come back. Some would argue that it shouldn't take that long. There's some companies that are kind of, dragging their feet. Apple, I think, is a great example of an American company that is fully dependent on a foreign supply chain in order to manufacture their goods. We saw around the April 2nd, tariff deadlines, or the I guess the tariff announcements that Apple was chartering 5 different planes in order to ship a lot of their iPhones out of Southeast Asia into the United States in order to avoid some of those extra costs. And so what I think we're seeing is that we're seeing an acceleration in things that were already happening. Now, for a lot of businesses, it's still going to be tough for them to find the component of the component or even the machine that makes the machine. That's been the biggest problem with reshoring of American manufacturing, is that during the 90s, when essentially all of these manufacturing processes were shipped out of the United States, they were shipped over, but also we lost that knowledge base. And
Yeah.
so when you're talking about bringing some of that manufacturing back, we frankly don't have enough of the knowledge base of it, what it takes to make the component of the component, the machine that builds the machine. There are some interesting companies that are trying to do that in the United States and have been trying to do that for a few years now. If you're going to bring manufacturing back, what does that actually look like in a modern day sense? Are we going to bring everything back, or are other things like toys and textiles, does it make more sense to just let other countries handle that part of the job? And so there's a lot of questions that are being asked right now, but it's also a situation where some of these things were already happening, and now it's just further incentive to we have to also discuss the lack of incentives for a lot of these, manufacturing, I guess, initiatives to take place. The biggest difference between U.S. and China is that China subsidizes a lot of their manufacturing capabilities, where they will pick certain industries that they will subsidize, versus the United States, where it's kind of like, figure it out. Like, it's up to you to figure it out, and both have pros and cons.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I actually posted something on LinkedIn about the tariffs, and someone commented on that about how the U.S. is at a disadvantage because China is subsidizing certain industries, and they can kind of play that long game. And I don't know, they don't seem to be blinking yet in terms of wanting to bring down their tariffs or to end the trade war. And to be fair, neither is the United States so far, except they have made exceptions for Apple or for computers and cell phones, which I imagine was Apple's doing, because it was really interesting. I just read an article about the CEO of Apple and about how he came up through the ranks building that global supply chain that's highly dependent on China. And I remember it was either that day or the next day was when the U.S. came out and said that they were going to make an exception for Apple. So I don't know, I imagine he's lobbying, or people like him are lobbying for exceptions from these tariffs. But other than Apple and computer and chip manufacturers, things like that, are there other industries or types of companies that are most affected by these trade wars?
Well, many industries, because like I said earlier, there are very few components. So the components is like the source of the product. Many of those are still all coming from China. And so it very much, or Southeast Asia. And then from the manufacturing landscape, they're out what China has done over the last 5 years, because this isn't the first time, Trump has kind of declared a trade war with China. He did it during his first term. And so for a lot of a lot of Chinese companies during that time frame, what they did is that they set up companies in Mexico, they set up companies in Vietnam, Chinese owned companies, that they're just another, I don't want to say a shell company, but they're another division, or another, division is probably the best word for it, but they're setting up another shop in another country, and then they're trying to avoid the tariff laws in that realm, or in that part of the world. And so that was the way that they kind of got around a lot of these tariff rules that were put in place during the first Trump administration. And then now we're coming into the second Trump administration. And for the Trump sort of economic team, what their strategy was is just cut everybody off at the knees and then manage the exceptions. That's how I'm kind of reading into it. It's, for better or worse, I don't want to, I guess get into the political realm of things of who I support and who I don't support, but I do get it from just a bearish approach where you're just going to cut everything and then wait for the loudest cries. And then from those loudest cries, like an Apple, who has been solely dependent on, a foreign government for their entire supply chain, it's forcing them to have some tough conversations as well. They have shifted some of their manufacturing into neighboring countries. Vietnam and India are some of the big winners so far. But they really should be doing much more with the enormous amount of cash balance that they have. I mean, it's more than, some countries' GDP. And
Yeah.
so it's a little bit of okay, we'll throw you a bone here, I think, from the Trump administration, if I'm reading between the lines, specifically when it comes to Apple. But they really should be. It's an American company. It's completely reliant on foreign entities, and so it's probably about time that a company like Apple was bringing all of their products back. Now, it's still a knowledge base gap. Do we have the skill set in the United States? Do we have the components of the components to be able to make the machinery and make the products and create the inputs? Especially when it comes to semiconductors, semiconductor manufacturing is predominantly handled in Taiwan. That has its own set of geopolitical issues that are going on, but it's mostly the electronic side of things that is being greatly impacted. Cars are kind of, especially US manufactured cars, if that kind of exists, um, those are the probably, I guess, the industry or the commodity that is going to be impacted the between, mid-size to large level. I would imagine that with car manufacturers in particular, they reshored a lot of their jobs, a lot of their capabilities already over to Mexico, and so they're kind of in a stagnant place right now where they can't really bring back a lot of those manufacturing jobs to the United States, where we were once building, the overwhelming majority of all the cars and trucks and vehicles in this country. That's been decimated as well. And so these are very long. These are things that happened over a long period of time, and we're going on what a week now for a lot of these companies to be thinking about this. Now, some of the bigger companies, of course, have should have been thinking about this for a lot longer, especially if you've been paying attention to the Trump administration, because that's all tariffs is all he's been talking about for 40 years. And so putting that strategy, that sourcing strategy in place is something that is long overdue. But it's also coupled with the fact that we've had a dramatic rise in technology adoption over the last handful of years inside of logistics. And so logistics and supply chain executives are starting to get a seat at the table where once we were just kind of seen as a cost center. And how do you, sort of save as much money as possible on transportation costs? In the global scheme of things, it probably doesn't make sense that we get, some rare earth minerals from South America and then ship them over to China in order for them to refine them and then assembly them in Vietnam and then ship them back over to Mexico and then have them, the final assembly there. And then from there it's shipped into the United States. And so there's lots of complex sourcing and strategic I guess initiatives going on, and software is helping to make those strategic partnerships.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what's interesting about what you're saying, and I agree that this is what will happen, is a lot of that production is not moving back to the US, it's moving to other developing countries. And I think that's the tricky part of this whole thing is, if anything, it might hurt China, but I don't know that it's necessarily benefiting the US. If there was a clear upside on the other side of this, it would make maybe a little bit more sense. But where I struggle is it doesn't seem as though, for example, I know like textiles, producing textiles in the US just doesn't make sense when you've got all these other developing countries with much lower labor costs, better access to materials. It doesn't make sense that you would bring that to the United States in some cases. So are there certain, like, is this just a big company problem? Or is this going to affect small and mid-market companies as well?
I think, unfortunately, it affects everyone. I would argue that on the small business side of things, if so there's a couple different threads I kind of want to pull on. So on the small business side of things, you have it's much tougher to keep up with all of the nuances and everything that's going on within global supply chain and trying to make sure that you can get a product, make it well, and give it to your customers at an affordable price where you can still make a little money over the top. Now, for small businesses, and that is the goal for any business, but that goes without saying. But for small businesses, you have the opportunity to be a little bit more nimble versus, say, like a Walmart global supply chain, or an Amazon global supply chain, or some of these other large retailers where overwhelming majority of their goods are probably coming from one country. Now, there's a little bit of competition that you could maybe with your suppliers inside of China. I have heard that Walmart is renegotiating all of their supplier agreements, and it's almost like what I've understand is a province versus a province over in China where they're competing. And from what I understand, Chinese manufacturers, they will pick up the phone at 1 a.m. If you are looking to source goods from somewhere else, if you are looking to find another supplier, they will answer the call. They will be super friendly, and they will work to earn that business. Now, in the United States, from what I understand, it's very difficult to get a call back, even for some of these specs. The lead time on developing the source of the source, or even a part for the machine that makes the source of the source, is sometimes months in advance. Now, there is an interesting company called Hadrian that I've been following, that they are utilizing the knowledge base that still exists, which is a little bit older of a knowledge base, a little bit older of an employee that has had manufacturing knowledge that was around and building things during the sort of the manufacturing renaissance of the United States before we offloaded all of the jobs overseas. So they're combining that knowledge base with an engineer that's focused on automation and AI. And what they're doing is they're making scans of the tool that builds the tool. That's where our biggest problem is for US manufacturing, is we don't have the machinery that makes the tool of the tool. Who stands to benefit a lot from that is maybe a country like Germany that can make really good machinery where we can import some of those machines over to the United States. Now, for Hadrian in particular, they are, what I think is the coolest thing is that they have 3D scans of their tools that's making the tool of the tool. They scan those machines for every single time that they are used, before and after. And so they know ahead of time if that tool of the machine that makes the machine is going to go down, or they need a replacement part in the near future. And so what they've done is they've reduced the amount of lead time that they need if a machine goes down. What happens at a lot of manufacturing facilities is that the tool will go down, the tool that makes the tool that gets the tool will go down, and then that line, that supply chain, that supply line is out of commission until they get that tool of the tool. And what Hadrian is doing is monitoring it from an AI perspective, and they want to get ahead of it before that becomes a problem. I think that is rethinking how we manufacture goods, bringing back manufacturing in an intelligent way is the future for the United States, and how we bring back manufacturing. I don't see us, making a lot of textiles, because to your point, that can be done in other countries at a much lower rate than what could be done in the United States. But that also brings up, the nuance side of things, that, maybe some of the dominance of, apps like Temu and Shein and, the U.S. population's sort of addiction to cheap goods, maybe that needed to be broken a little bit. Maybe that we needed to take kind of like a moral step back and say, okay, what are we morally okay with purchasing? What are some things that I could purchase from another country that maybe has a little bit higher of a standard for their workplace conditions, and how they, that these companies are sourcing the product. And so there's a lot of different nuances that are now at play. And I think from an overarching theory is that, from a moral standpoint, it is my personal opinion that we needed to kind of be broken of purchasing these cheap goods that are just, fill landfills, and they don't really provide any kind of benefit to us as a U.S. society. But we're not going to bring that kind of manufacturing back. What is the AI automation, like high tech advantage that the United States does have? We, technology wise, us and China are 1A and 1B. And so what can we do to bring manufacturing back, and then also make from, just a moral standpoint, what we're okay with purchasing, what kind of things we're okay with sort of a standard of living, and then making our purchasing decisions there. Because there's a lot of interesting things also happening on the TikTok side of things, where now Chinese manufacturers are going direct to the TikTok users and saying, if you want to buy laundry pods, you can get 1,000 of them for, 2 cents for each of them. furniture, automobiles, all of these different things that are made in China that, we could cut out the middleman and buy direct. But then it gives the US consumer a lot more freedom and optionality, which optionality is probably the key from both a consumer standpoint and then also a business standpoint of being able to pick and choose where you want to kind of, plant your flag in the ground as far as, your moral stances.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like over the years, the last couple decades, even well before the trade wars, but going back to the globalization movement that really picked up steam in the 90s with NAFTA and some of the other free trade agreements across the world. It seems like more, as more commodity-based manufacturing moved away from developed countries like the US and Western Europe, a lot of those manufacturing jobs moved to other third world or developing countries. And what it was replaced by, at least largely in the US and I believe Western Europe, it's the same thing. It's a lot of more complex manufacturing, so higher value add sorts of manufacturing where it's engineer to order, make to order, complex products that we're manufacturing now. We're not manufacturing textiles the way we did 50 years ago, but we are manufacturing really complex products. But so that's great. We can do a lot of that manufacturing here, but they still have to get the parts and the components and the raw materials from China or from other countries, right? And that's the rub here.
Yeah, because if you look at manufacturing, or you just look at, I do a regular series called Source to Porch, figuring out, and chocolate was a perfect example because the overwhelming majority of the world's chocolate is sourced from two countries, Guyana or not Guyana, it was Ghana and I believe Peru is where the overwhelming majority of the world's chocolate is manufactured, or is the cocoa bean is grown. Now, where the money is actually made is in the refining of that. Very similar to rare earth metals, where you can have access to rare earth metals, you can have access to the cocoa pods or the cocoa beans, but to refine them is where that the real money is made in manufacturing and processing. Is that you're shipping those goods to a country that's going to refine it and get it ready for purchasing. And so for a lot of US, or for a lot of the United States, a lot of Europe as well, we're not doing the refining, we're not doing the processing. And so that goes for natural gas, that goes for oil. We can pull it out of the ground, but if we don't have a way to process and refine it, then we're not going to see the significant gains that we want to see being made and manufactured for the full supply chain to take effect. Because to your point, the just-in-time delivery was a strategy for 20 years where you only want to keep the inventory that you plan on selling. You don't even need to order the inventory until, maybe a couple months out. Now we're seeing the reverse where, there are companies that are stocking up well in advance. I've heard of retailers that are already stocking up for back to school items. They're storing those goods now just to get ready for August, which they're not sure what the purchasing landscape or even the tariff landscape is going to look like then. So they're front loading those items now in the first quarter of the year versus waiting for, the just in time philosophy that has existed for really the last 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to come back to a point you just made a couple minutes ago and related to a question here from the audience. This is from Darian on YouTube. Darian says, is this a case where AI and logistics tech are actually delivering on the promise? So in other words, is AI going to be able to help us out here, as we're trying to navigate these sourcing changes and all the supply chain disruptions this is going to cause?
Yeah, I mean, the answer nobody wants to hear is it depends, because it depends on the software that you're getting. It depends on the data that they have access to. Now, a company that I do follow pretty closely is a company called Vision, Vizion. They handle they're called what's called a visibility platform, and so they have insight into the different trade patterns all over the world, and so they're able to, whoever they're working with, customer wise, gives them that data. They anonymize the data, and then they're able to give out reports and send out reports based on what they're seeing in cargo ship flows, trade lanes, even down to like the bills of lading that are coming into the country. They have software that will scan all of those things and put it into digestible data that, we can kind of all understand. Now, where AI is coming into play, especially this year, I know there are a couple of companies that specify just on tariffs and just on the different requirements for importing and exporting. Every single country has their own import and export laws. And so if you are a freight forwarder, if you're, a freight broker, it's mostly freight forwarders that are handling cross-border trade. They have, or they should have, the software that will be able to not only look at the visibility patterns of global trade shipments, but they should also be able to look at the purchasing habits, upcoming holidays, consumer sentiment. They all have tools that can measure those little things, but where, especially right now, the software, the AI software that will be able to look at all of the different tariff laws, be able to update their systems pretty frequently, because we're seeing, these tariff rate exchanges differ sometimes by the hour over the last week. And so if you have the software that can keep up with all of those different rules and regulations, then you're doing far better than your competitors. And I would also argue that this isn't something that, maybe a CEO or, a typical small business should be thinking about. This is where the partners that come in, the freight forwarders that you work with, the freight brokers that you work with, it's their job to be in the trenches of this kind of knowledge. But what's good about all of this is that hopefully you have a really good partner in the movement of your goods, or the sourcing of your goods, so you can focus on your business. But I would argue that over the last 5 years, especially since the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, that, supply chain leaders and logistics leaders now have a seat at the boardroom table. And so they're able to give their insight and strategic. There are people who are using software now to game plan for worst case scenarios of if we are completely blocked off from China trade in particular, what does that simulation look like? And so for a lot of the bigger players, they are using technology. They are using AI and logistics tech to solve some of these problems and prepare for unforeseen problems, because that's essentially what we do in logistics and supply chain. Like, we can't control these geopolitical events, but it's our job to problem solve. And so hopefully you have a good partner in that regard. And hopefully that partner is using technology that can go through a lot of these different just complexities that are involved with importing and exporting all across the world. Because like I said, every country has their own stipulations, and you got to follow those laws.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. Well, here's a couple interesting comments. Olivia on YouTube says AI is a Ponzi, so we won't get into that. That's a comment.
That's basic.
Right. And this is from Darian on YouTube, as a follow up to something you said, Blythe. She says, you touched on Shine, Temu, and the moral cost of our addiction to cheap goods. If we're serious about reshoring or ethical sourcing, what kind of public awareness or business leadership do you think it will take to really shift behavior?
I think moral and a greater awareness around. So we had talked earlier in this show about, just how mainstream supply chain feels now. Supply chain nobody understood what I did for work 5 years ago. My parents still kind of don't understand what I do for work and how I cover this industry. And the greater majority of people don't have an idea of where their goods are coming from. But the smartest companies that I've seen have a page dedicated on their website that tells the supply chain journey of their products. There's even a company that's based in Europe that I believe has a sheep farm, and you can adopt a sheep, and you adopt the sheep and you can get a coat made out of the wool that comes from that sheep, and you could see the entire process. And so we mentioned earlier about visibility and how you can only really see visibility depending on whoever is inputting that data into that visibility tool software. There are a lot of really smart companies that are taking the direct to consumer route, where they will list right on their website where their goods come from, where they are sourced, if they're ethically sourced. There's software that requires that of their suppliers, that, hey, do you have an eye washing station inside of your manufacturing facility? Where are you sourcing these products from? Are you sourcing it through slave labor? Are you sourcing it through, people that are paid well relative to where they live? And so for a lot of companies, I have seen, not a lot, I would say for some companies I would like to see more of, is that these companies are showcasing their supply chain front and center and using their supply chain as a differentiator and trying to stand out from their competitors, so that they can say, like, we have done our due diligence, we have done our job, And here is where our supply chain comes from. And you can choose from a moral standpoint to support that company or support some of those suppliers. And I think that's a big reason why, if you have a TikTok account right now, your For You page, if you're anything like me, it's flooded with direct to consumer. Chinese manufacturers are going right to TikTok and trying to win the information war in addition to the trade war, which the governments are taking part of. But for a lot of other businesses, they can establish these relationships and establish these partnerships to see them into the future, not necessarily doing things that just because it's the way it's always been done, but rethinking how you're going to be doing business. And for a lot of companies, they frankly have had their head in the sand and they don't want to address some of these things. But I think for companies that have taken a more global approach and customer sentiment, consumer sentiment, they're the ones that are going to be the real leaders and the real winners. Is that if you're upfront with how you get your goods, how they're properly made, how they're shipped, how they're sourced, it's a marketing benefit for you. And in a world where everybody's getting their goods from the same from the same countries or the same region, you look for a leg up when you can.
Right. Yeah. Now, what about, here's a follow-up question from YouTube again, but do you see this whole Chinese manufacturers bypassing traditional retail, going direct to consumer with cheap goods? Do you see this growing into a serious threat for domestic brands, especially direct to consumer companies?
Yes, because there is what's called IP law, and for a lot of the United States, especially for some manufacturer or some businesses in the United States, they do the hard work and they create a business. They go to what's called a contract manufacturer and they say, "This is what I want to make. Can you help me make it?" Then they help them make it, and then they can flip it around to another company, have that company make the same exact product, and then flood sites like Etsy and Amazon with your product, your idea, and be able to charge a lower rate for that same product. And so for going direct to DDC is going to be really, I think, beneficial on the Chinese side of things. And then on the US side of things, you have to kind of ask yourself, like, what kind of business do you want to run, especially for small businesses? There's been a growing complaint of sellers on Amazon, sellers on Etsy, where they come up with an original idea and they're quickly overtaken by somebody who undercuts them on price. Sometimes it's Amazon itself that does these things. But if you, it comes back to, I think, the moral conversation of, if you go to an arts market, and this is just, my anecdotal experience, but you go to an arts market or you go to a convention or a trade show, you see a lot of goods that where they're manufactured, and you see the upcharge in the price. And there's a lot of like the cheap goods and things like that are flooding even, our artist markets at a local level. And so for a lot of, essentially what's a drop shipper, a lot of those companies are going to be upended. Now, for other companies that are making sort of the source of the product, I think that they still have a competitive advantage, but consumers are going to try to always just shop for the cheapest, quickest good. But I think what will change is moving from the just-in-time concept to, I think I can wait a few weeks to get 1,000 laundry pods from China. They're all manufactured the same way. So it also creates this level of, do we want to support that brand because of the brand name? Do we want to buy $300 pairs of Nikes when we know that they're making them for $20? And so it's a lot of like the shifting consumer behavior that I think is going to be greatly impacted. And so for a lot of, I think it's super smart for a lot of these Chinese manufacturers to be flooding your TikTok feeds with, you can get your furniture here. You can get a house made for $20,000 and shipped over. A lot of these things I think are great in the short term for pricing wise, but then in the long term, it's going to be more incentive to reshore a lot of those manufactured goods, but it has to be the products that make the most sense.
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left, maybe as sort of a lightning round, a speed round question. What other supply chain trends are you seeing here in 2025 that we should be aware of?
I would say greater tech adoption. AI, you can't go to a conference without talking about AI. And so AI is machine learning. I know everybody wants to put the buzzword on it. It's machine learning. And so what are you doing with your data and how are you making it, streamlined for greater AI adoption? So you can't turn your head at a logistics conference without somebody mentioning the word AI. And so I would still say that AI, but there's a lot of data cleanup that needs to be done in order to see that come to its full potential.
Right, right. Well, good. Well, thanks for being here today, Blythe. Really appreciate your time and great stuff. And I'd love to have you back on, especially as these trade wars, supply chain disruptions unfold. And we know a little bit more. It'd be great to have you on as sort of a touch point to see how things are evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be back. It's a complex subject. There's lots of, moving parts in it, but hopefully, the audience gains some value from the perspective that we have that as of, 11 a.m. on the East Coast of
Right,
April 15th,
right,
that, there's, some decisions that could be made to benefit a lot of parties, not just you yourself, but maybe your family, maybe your small business, all the way up to the biggest companies in the world. There's got to be some questions that you answer and some changes that are made. It sucks, but it's necessary.
right. Well, great. Well, appreciate your time and appreciate everyone's great questions here. And thanks for being here. You'll see this episode premiere on Transformation Ground Control in 2 weeks. So go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can check all the past episodes in the meantime and keep up with that show. We do these live discussions, same time, same place every week. So hope to see you here again soon and hope you all have a great week in the